Bob, over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's very... thanks, Kofi, for just about using up the entire subject in 17 minutes. Great. It's very difficult to follow a man who has been the world's referee for so many years and one of the historic great Africans. I don't think there's any question of that, ladies and gentlemen. So it's fantastic that I do stuff with them. It's such an odd turn of events in my life. However, Gordon, I have to say that that joke was crap 30 years ago. And it's crap now. Kofi is one of the great Africans, and he, as we know, speaks eloquently and spoke entirely from the perspective of being an African this evening, which is correct. Let me speak then from the perspective of being a European. It is the best place to do it, in fact, in this hall, where so many misunderstandings of Africa were laid out before us and indeed implemented from these rooms. But we have here two great Africans, as I said, Mo and Kofi. I don't think there's any great Europeans here. So Africans are far more interested, quite correctly, in where they stand in the 21st century than Europe appears to be. And that's a serious mistake. We're not serious about Africa, ladies and gentlemen. This room is packed because we are. But we have in our heads still, I believe, an almost exotic view of this continent. Some of you were born there, some of you were raised there, many of us have visited it, all of us have a passion for it. It is one of those few places where you need to go back to time and time again. It has this quality about it that is fairly indefinable. But it is 8 miles from us. And it is a continent uniquely outside the global economic net. And it will remain exotic, mired in topics like corruption, hunger, ill health, lack of education, lack of growth, until we begin to review our relationship with our closest continental neighbour, because we are bound inextricably, historically, but going forward into the future. The demographic of Europe is inexorably growing older. We just learned today that the population of Great Britain is not in fact 50 million, but in a matter of years will be 70 million. And most of those will be old. And very few young will have to support the rest of us. We can't do that. We can't live the way we've chosen and continue, and neither can the rest of Europe. We need Africans. We need their unskilled labour, and we need their skilled labour. We all know that if Ghanaian doctors and nurses decided to return to Ghana, the National Health Service would collapse even further than it already is. So what do we do? Let us examine this through the prism of self-interest then. What we do is we spend our European millions ridiculously on our naval patrols of the Mediterranean. Now, ladies and gentlemen, many of us will have met Africans on our summer holidays on the beaches of Malta, Sicily, the Canaries, Mallorca, wherever. They'll have been dead. They'll have been on the beaches, but we'll have met them. Because right now, this second, boys and girls are walking across a desert the size of the United States to come to us, right now. You are not going to stop them. I'm an immigrant. I came here for a better life. I'm extremely grateful to this country, and I ain't going back. But Ireland, in fact, is the richest country pro rata in the world. When I left it, it was the poorest country in Europe. Thus, things change. And the same will happen to Africa, where there won't be those boys and girls being turned back, where they won't wash up on our beaches in the summer, where they'll have a life and want to reinvest in their countries. But to do that, we have to have growth. We have to have economic growth. But you can't have growth with political instability, with a lack of civic society. You can't have it when climate change impacts and puts entire populations on the move. All of you are aware of the floods this summer in Britain. I think 2 people died. Are you aware that there are floods right across a given region of Africa where 1.5 million people are on the move right now? No. But how can a government stabilise its own situation, its own growth? Now, growth isn't the be-all and end-all. Growth is not a cure-all, but no growth is a kill-all. It's as simple as that. Africa contributes 2% to global trade. 2. We have 98%, they have 2. And if we remove the extractive industries from that, they have 0.5%. 0.5. Yet it's an incredibly dynamic continent. One of the reasons, of course, is that we inhibit trade with that continent. And one of the first things that must happen at the EU-AU summit coming up is that we address this imbalance because, frankly, the Doha round has failed. Peter Mandelson doesn't really want to admit it. No government wants to really admit it, but it is sort of the Monty Python sketch of trade rounds, isn't it? You know, the parrot sketch where he goes into the pet shop and he asks for a parrot. And he gets handed it and he says, it's dead. And the guy says, no, it's not dead, it's sleeping. And he goes, it's dead. Ladies and gentlemen, the Doha round isn't sleeping, it's dead. And we may in 2 years cobble together a political artifice that allows it to continue. But it is a great tragedy for us. It takes 500 billion out of the world economy. But for the poor, it actually isn't that bad a thing. Called as it was in the name of the poor in Doha 6 years ago, whatever it was, Kofi 7 years ago. They've haggled and cobbled and done this and done that until they've taken the poor out of the equation. So even if Doha succeeds, and I suggest it won't, we need to do some sort of standalone trade deal that allows Africans to own their own resources and trade with us equally as partners. And in failing to do this, in our hubris at the end of history, when the Cold War collapsed and free trade and democracy was the great winner, we chucked them a couple of pennies. It was called aid. Now, aid is vital. Aid is truly vital. Mozambique is a great example. Kofi alluded to the fact of African economic growth. And despite what I said about the extractive industries, actually 17 countries with no natural resources, extractive resources, show 5% growth per annum. 5%. That isn't enough. They have to show 7% consistently to even begin to get on the ladder, where they begin to have stable governance, where they can actually tax their own people. About 90% of the total continental economy of Africa is a black economy. It's not that people are duplicitous. It's that you must entertain the idea of nothing. Having nothing, nothing at all. No pants, no socks, no skirt, nothing. And then you get a pot, then you get a bit of dirty water and a couple of sticks, and on the corner of a street, Benin somewhere, you get a carrot and you make a stew and you sell it and you get a couple of pence and you go home. That's it. That's part of the black economy. Or if you're familiar with those roadside petrol stations with the beautiful Nigerian oil bottles, and there's a woman selling petrol there. She takes it home and divides up whatever she got. But to collect taxes on that, to create a tax collecting structure, will cost more than the total amount of tax you could possibly collect. So how do you grow a state? How do you give benefit to the state, to the citizens? Ask Africans how much they're taxed, they'll tell you. Ask them what they get in return, and they look querulously at you. What do you mean? And you say taxes alone to a government, you get back health, you get back education. In fact, ask a Brit what happens to his tax and you'll get the same fucking expression. But they'll often say, forget it, that doesn't happen here, but it can happen. And so with aid, you get prime pumping of an economy. Mozambique, 7 to 12% growth consistently. It's not for nothing that Chissano got Mo's Prize yesterday. It works. Governance works. We know that. 50% of the economy of Uganda and Mozambique, I think, I'm not sure about Botswana, but it's foreign aid. And when Kofi referred to the difference between Malaya and Ghana in the 60s, it wasn't simply that there were endless coups d'etat in Ghana. It was that in the 60s, Africa and Asia were at an economic equilibrium, and it was Africa was expected to go ahead. But they didn't. Why? Because they never managed to diversify out of the fickleness of a resource economy. Commodities go up and down like that. So not just political instability, but actually resource instability, world instability. And into this gap that we allowed to happen between the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the 21st century, a new giant stepped into the vacuum that we really didn't notice in the Commission for Africa until the last 2 weeks. And I insisted on pushing in a paragraph about China because I noticed when I was there that the trucks from China no longer painted out the Chinese characteristics and wrote in English. They kept the Chinese characteristics. And I said, these guys are everywhere. And we put in something, ladies and gentlemen, that was 2004. And China is engaged in an entirely mercantilist expedition of Africa. They don't come with a political agenda. And they're driving huge amounts of growth. But at what cost? Certainly, autocratic governments will be enshrined there. They'll be allowed to do whatever they like. Last week alone, the Chinese promised to build 3,500 kilometers of rail in the Congo, 128 health centers, 31 hospitals, and 2 universities. Amazing. Well done, the Congo. Except what's the point of university without books? What's the point of a hospital without medicines? And that rail will go straight to the port of Malindi and on to Chinese interests in Angola and Zambia. Whatever. Who cares? There's no infrastructure in Africa. It cannot grow without infrastructure. So this is the issue to hand. India and China are producing everything we need. America is buying it. Africa is providing the raw materials to power this huge growth. Will its citizens see the benefit, and what's Europe's view? Answer came there, none. A squabble over aid and buttons. Glen Eagles was the great step forward, but it's still buttons. 50 billion per annum from the thousands of trillions of dollars of the G7 for a continent of 51 or 52 countries. It's a nothing. It's not serious. It isn't serious. So the foreign aid that Mozambique gets, 50% of its economy, the other 50% will be aluminium, more or less, an extractive industry. The idea is, as they diversify out and grow their economy, the foreign aid drops, and that is indeed what happens. China was a net recipient of foreign aid 4 years ago. This year it pulls 1% of its entire population out of extreme poverty. 1% of China. It works. We need to write the check. That's step one. Step two, we need a trade deal. They need to buy our stuff, we need to buy theirs. 60 years ago, another bankrupt, ruined, starving continent required the same aid. There was one economy in the planet, the US, and they needed someone to buy their stuff. So they gave us 1% of GDP for 4 years, the Marshall Plan, and it worked. We grew wealthy. In fact, we grew to be the healthiest, wealthiest continent the world has ever seen. That's us. Well done us, 60 years. There is no way that in 2040, it's not conceivable that Africa will not be one of the dynamic economic powers, and we need to have been their friend. What is our response to China overtly extracting whatever it requires from Africa, and India flying under the radar, doing exactly the same? There are more Indians in Africa than anywhere else outside India. More Indians born there, more than anywhere else in the world except in India. So they're there. What was the US response to this? Bush, as it turns out, was pretty good with Africa. He's increased aid 3 times and will have done it 4 times before he leaves. The Global Fund for AIDS is now treating, I think it's up to 1.2, 1.3 million people a day in Africa. In 2002, it was 50,000 people a day. And Bush's own personal fund, PEPFAR, treats kind of more or less the same a number. But this isn't enough. Instead of American business looking at the same opportunities that China and India are looking at, it decided to set up AFRICOM, a militarist response. Previously, North Africa was dealt with by European Command, Middle Africa by Middle East Command, and South Africa by Asia Command. Now, China, rampant throughout Africa, must be viewed as a threat. To what? The oil resources of Nigeria and Angola, where America will take 25% of its oil in 10 years. And there are plans, potentially, to put military bases in Sao Tome and Principe in the Gulf of Guinea. Why there? Because that's where the oil is. That isn't good enough. What's Europe's response to this? Nothing. And if it kicks off in Africa, we are 8 miles from there. So I'm going to stop now and leave you with this singular thought. Gordon referred to 1984, when I saw this awful pornography of poverty on the BBC. Tonight, like every other night, 90% of the children of Africa will go to bed hungry. And it will happen tomorrow and the next day. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not serious about this. Europe is not serious about it.